And we're live.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome. If we haven't met yet, my name is Joe Bunting, and I'm an author and also the founder of The Right Practice. I'm so glad to have you with us for this live webinar today that we're doing with Reedsy. It's going to be really fun. When I started The Right Practice in 2011, I had a lot of questions. How do you become a writer? How do you write a really great book, a book that can be published, but also a book that, if it's not too much to ask, can change lives and make some kind of impact in the world? And then how do you make a career out of that? The Right Practice, I was kind of already living my dream. I was already working as a professional writer. I'd already written a book that was about to be published, but at the same time, I also knew that I had so much to learn. And so I started The Right Practice both as a way to pass along some of my knowledge, but even more as a way to learn more about the writing craft and grow as a writer. And that's why I'm so excited to get to be here today with Reedsy, because we're going to learn so much from some experts in the publishing industry, people who have been in and around publishing for decades, and have so much to teach us about how to be better writers. I know I'm going to be taking careful notes, and I'm sure you will want to too, because this is going to be great stuff. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Ricardo, but thank you guys for being here and enjoy the training.
Thank you so much, Joe. And just before I start, I want to make sure that everyone, at least among the speakers, can see the slides.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. So hopefully the listeners can see the slides as well. Yeah, so thanks for the intro, Joe. As you said, we're going to learn a lot today. I've been doing this for quite a few times now. And you'd think that we'd be presenting the same thing every time, but I do learn something new about revision every time I do a webinar. So for those who don't know me, I'm one of the founders of Reedsy. I'm Ricardo Fayette. And you can interact with me on Twitter for those of you who haven't given up on that platform yet. So add Ricardo Fayette right there. So I'm not going to be doing a lot of the talking today because we're going to be talking about manuscript revision, and I'm not an editor. However, on Reedsy, we have some of the world's best editors. So I've put together a panel that loves to talk about revision. And I'll let them introduce themselves to start with. So Laura, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Hey everybody, my name's Laura May Isaacman, and I'm currently a freelance book editor and short story editor, focusing on mostly literary and commercial fiction. I've spent about 6 years as publisher and editor of the literary magazines, The Coffin Factory and Tweed's Magazine of Literature and Art. And for the past year and a half, I've been running a book editing company.
Awesome. Yeah, Laura is our short story expert at Reedsy. She's done some really amazing webinar on that topic. Erin, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Hi, my name is Erin. I am a freelance editor and a literary agent at Distal, Goderich, and Barrett. And I have been working on all types of fiction. I would say my specialties are in fantasy and young adult and middle grade, but I really like to delve into it all.
Awesome, thanks. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael. I also working as a freelance fiction editor. Before that, I was editor-director of Del Rey at Penguin Random House UK. And before that, I was a bookseller and a head office fiction buyer at Waterstones Booksellers, which is for the American audience, they're a bit like Barnes and Noble in the UK, in the US. I specialised in science fiction, fantasy, horror, and crime and thrillers, and commercial fiction for the most part. But also, I like to dabble in other things as well. A bit of romance, bit of everything, really. Yeah.
Bit of everything. So Michael's our only representative from the UK. Well, I'm in the UK as well, but on the panel. I know it shows a little map world, but it's mostly US and UK. Jim?
Hi, I'm Jim, and I am a former production editor for Hachette Book Group, specifically Orbit Science Fiction and Fantasy, as well as Yen Press. I was also an editor at DC Comics, and I've been a freelance book editor for a number of years now, primarily focusing on genre fiction, so science fiction, fantasy, thrillers, action adventure, but also doing work in nonfiction, such as self-help and memoirs.
Awesome. So as you can see, well, pretty good panel, if I may say so, to talk about what publishers want in terms of manuscript revision. So why is manuscript revision important? I think Mark Twain says it best. A successful book is not made of what is in it, but what is left out of it. And so that's where revision and editing comes in. It's where you separate the wheat from the chaff, and hopefully you submit a manuscript to publishers that they will want to keep reading. So why is that important? Well, as you probably all know, literary agencies, especially well-known ones, receive around 100 or 200 query letters every day. And most of the big five that authors want to reach, most of their imprints are close to unagented submissions, which means you first need to get an agent, and then they'll pitch your manuscript to those imprints. So the big question is, how do you stand out? And every time I ask an editor, an agent, or publisher that question, they tell me you need a great book. There's no other secret. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is how you can craft a great book, not through writing, but through revision. So we'll be covering the common errors you should watch out for. That's honestly most of what we're going to be talking about today. So giving you kind of clues, tips of when you start rereading your first draft, your second draft, your third draft, things you should be watching out for in your revision. Again, sections you should dedicate special attention to. We're going to talk about the opening. We're going to talk about the pivotal scenes. We're going to talk about the ending. Then how many rounds of revisions you should plan for, and how and when to involve beta readers and editors. And all the idea behind it is, what do publishers want to see? All these questions are aimed at, how do I prepare my manuscript so that it is ready for publishers? And even if you're going to self-publish afterwards, you're going to want to see. The question in the end is the same. With the most common hurdles, I love to start with that slide because it sets us immediately in the spirit of revision. So I'm going to ask our panel to basically tell us the one thing that their number one tip or the number one mistake that they see authors making out there. Erin, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think probably the most important thing is to make sure that once you are submitting to agents, you know that your work is 100% complete, at least in your mind. Because you won't get another chance to submit to these agents, sometimes for up to 6 months. Sometimes they don't ever want to see that work again. So you have to make sure that when you send it, you're sending the piece that you're most satisfied with.
Absolutely. And I often see authors emailing me and saying, I've got this short list of 5 agents, I'm going to send in my manuscript. And most of the time it's too early. And especially the agents who you think are really right for your book, you should prepare your book and revise it as much as possible before you send it to them. You don't want to burn your chance. Which brings us to what you should be doing in that revision and what to watch out for. So what should authors watch out for in their manuscript, Michael?
Well, I mean, obviously, Erin's probably given the best advice already, but I think there are things you can, obviously, once you're happy with the book and everything, as we've said, and you think it's ready to send out. I mean, there are some very sort of basic things to make sure, and like the slide says, you want to make sure that the structural plan and the plot works. And I think there are easy things you can do as well. I mean, most editors and agents will want to see a high standard of technical, English literature as well, which is kind of important. So, while I don't think it's always expected that the book is perfect, obviously, you're not going to necessarily need to have every single, sort of grammar point as it would be as a finished book. I think there are lots of little bits and bobs that people tend to overlook in the basic thing like dialogue punctuation and how to use things like ellipses and em dashes and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a good thing for people to look at, as well as the big picture stuff about the book actually being as good as it can be. I think there's a technical aspect to it. I always find as well, when I was a commissioning editor, I thought a lot of people overuse the prologue as the start of a book. And if you think that that's the first thing that an editor or an agent's going to see when they look at your manuscript, it's tough, because they're not always the best example of the writing of the novel. So I think that's an important thing to look at as well. And you need that opening to be great, really. I mean, the first sort of 3,000 to 5,000 words of the book really need to be even more than the whole novel together. That's really got to be the point where you capture that editor or agent's attention and make them want to read on.
Yeah, we'll be talking more about the opening in the next few slides. We'll be talking more actually about all these revision tips in the next few slides. But we're starting with the number one thing that you spot in authors' manuscripts, Laura.
It really is, a lack of tension in a novel. I think that's what most agents are looking for. And, I've worked with a lot of agents in the past, and they're really looking for books that sort of build to something. Even in literary fiction, if you have a novel that's very character driven and it's not plot driven, that character needs to be building towards something that happens that makes that character change or reconsider things or have a different point of view. If your character is sort of bumbling along, or your storyline is sort of bumbling along with no major challenges to your characters, no major decisions for them to make, if you're not putting them in difficult situations that are going to create tension in the book and therefore create tension in the reader, then an agent is not going to be as interested, because an agency is a business like everything else, and they're looking to sell your book. And in order to sell it, it's got to be riveting to a reader, and they've got to see the potential for it to make them money. And people read as a way to sort of go into another world and sort of get really involved in that. So you've got to create the world, and in our world every day, there's all kinds of decisions to be made and changes in direction and all that stuff. So you've got to sort of mimic that for your novel.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jim, what's your number one thing?
Well, as it says on the slide, we've got not providing the reader with enough visual cues, but we'll talk about, showing versus telling later on. One-note characters, again, that kind of speaks back to what Michael was talking about, in terms of world building and having your plot there, that everything that needs to be there is there and has a reason for being. But probably the biggest one is, particularly since I tend to work in genre fiction, is authors who spend far too much time thinking about this book that they're doing as book one in a series. While that's a great and wonderful thing, and it's awesome that you've constructed a series around this, around this book, that you have enough material to carry yourself for 5, 6, 7 books. You've got to sell book number one in order for the series to actually ever come into being. So it's better to think of that first book as it has to be a self-contained unit. It has to have its own beginning, middle, and an end. It can't have a beginning, middle, cliffhanger that then leads to a beginning, middle in book 2 that then leads to another cliffhanger, and so on and so forth, until you finally get to the end, which is book 4 or 5 in your series. Everything needs to be self-contained, and it's better to think of the subsequent books in the series as a sequel to something that was already working, rather than, going in specifically thinking this is book one in, my great grand epic.
Yeah, and especially for those who are going to pitch a manuscript to agents and publishers, I can be mistaken, but what I've heard is that what you pitch to an agent is one book. It's not a series of books. If they like book one, and if a publisher publishes book one and the book one does well, then they're gonna be interested in a series.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's why it's super important to make sure that book one is can work as a standalone, so that so that there's tension. Actually, we go back to tension throughout the book, and especially in the first few chapters. So these are the main things: prologues, openings, tension, not spending too much time setting up a series. And now we're gonna go deeper into proper revision tips. So the revision tips will be from our panel of editors, but I'll add a few quotes from famous authors as well, because that's always nice. So the first tip is going to be not from our editors, but from myself. I think one thing that we come across too often at Reedsy is authors who just finish their first draft, especially after NaNoWriMo. December is a super busy month for us because people finish their first draft. It's only 50,000 words, but let's say it's a novel, and they just want to hire an editor right away, or they want to submit it to agents and publishers. And I just want to say you need to take time away from your work and revise it, obviously, before you send it to editors. But the first thing I'd say is put it in a drawer, let it sit for 2 weeks or a month. Start working on book two if you want to keep writing, but take your mind off of it so that when you come back to the book, you're not in author mode, you're in reader mode or editor mode. And that makes a huge difference when it comes to revision. Let your book sit for 2 weeks. You're in editor mode. You come back to your book. What do, Jim? You kill your darlings?
You definitely kill your darlings. It's an old adage, but it's still very, very true, and I see this all the time, where authors get very attached to a particular character. They get attached to a particular scene, a plot device, or even, a stylistic choice that they think, that they just become so attached to. They think it's inherent, that it's essential to the novel. And ultimately, if it's not moving the story forward, it's not that essential. This gets back to what I was talking about with one-note characters, where it's like, oh, I've got this really neat character who's going to come in, give this one line that's so important, and then we're never going to see that character again. It's far better that that character get merged in with another character that has a very similar role, and then ultimately you end up with a stronger supporting character out of it. But yeah, you can't be precious about anything when you go back to edit. Everything is eligible on the chopping block, from how your story opens to how it ends.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. You can't be precious. I'm going to reuse that. Laura, do you want to talk about show, don't tell?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most common mistakes in writing. I think that authors sort of get so wrapped up in their story because they know the story so well, they know the characters so well. They've spent the most amount of time with the characters and with the story, and it's very easy to overlook these sort of general statements. They can envision maybe a character yelling, and when they see the character yelling, for example, they can see the veins popping out of the character's necks and the face getting red, and they can see their movements. They can totally envision the scene. But as a reader, as a first-time reader, I don't have that same relationship with the book and with the characters, and I need for that description to be there. I need to see that the character is so angry that the veins are popping out of his neck. I need to, obviously depending on what kind of writing you're doing, if you want to describe, the shade of red in their face, it's very easy to sort of summarize these things into simple sentences, but it really doesn't serve the author or the book, because it really keeps the reader at too much of a distance. So definitely, one piece of advice that I really, really strongly recommend for writers, and I end up doing it a lot when I'm doing line editing, and it's often the same thing. A writer will make the same mistakes, and I'm making the same comments. It's okay. Well, this reader gave a certain look. Well, the character gave a certain look. Well, what did that look like? You know, if they looked at someone else from across the room, in what way? What about their body language? You know, are they leaning? Are they standing up straight? Like, there's so many details that you can convey to a reader, and it's so easy to sort of to not do that. And the one piece of advice that I think is really helpful for writers is to sort of envision yourself as a painter. When you paint a canvas, when you paint a scene, you are putting in every single detail that you want the person who's coming to look to see. You don't sort of make a box and let the person assume that it's a house. You know, you put in the windows, you see what kind of house, is it 2 stories? I mean, all those sort of details, that's for the artist to convey. And I think it's really the same with writing.
That's a perfect metaphor. And it brings us to actually Erin's advice, because often authors, they're not showing very well, which can create unbelievable conflicts.
Yeah, I think it's a very subtle art, the art of showing. You want to make sure that while you're showing, you're not being too subtle to the point where the reader can't tell what you're trying to convey. For example, if you're trying to show that somebody has murderous intent, you can't just say that they looked at a kitchen knife on the table and assume that everyone knows that that means that they have murderous intent. So, you know, you have to step back and try and look at it. I always say this, but I think it's such a good representation of how you should show something. Look at it as if you were trying to show a movie. You know, what subtle things do they show in movies that allow you to grasp greater meaning? And try and use that same technique in your writing.
Yeah, and that's why I think show don't tell is the #1 advice when it comes to revision and is used everywhere. It's because it kind of impacts everything else, and it's also very subtle advice because, as you said, there are ways of showing, there are ways of telling that can be wrong or right. We've got a good blog post around that.
And to go more on this, it tends to lead to unbelievable conflicts if you set something up. Let's go back to my previous example of murderous intent. If you just showed that person looking at the knife on the table and then have them go into a conflict in which, you know, they then end up murdering someone, your reader is going to be a little bit confused because here's this nice housewife who is now murdering somebody, and you never understood that they ever had these thoughts before that moment.
It's a perfect example, yeah. So now moving away from show don't tell, we're going to look more at the overall structure and the plot of the book. Michael, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose it's the old classical dramatic structure, isn't it? Freytag's pyramid. In modern fiction, obviously you can experiment, you can do whatever you want within reason, but there are conventions and there are easy ways of gauging whether you've got the basics down. So I think normally you could argue that you'd start with an inciting incident, as the graph shows, and then that would usually be some sort of expositional beginning with an emotional or an action-based hook showing sort of internal or external conflict, and then that would lead you into the rising action where you obviously you build towards the climax. And I think one of the things that I think a lot of people get that, I think the thing for me that I find often doesn't work quite so well is that the falling action, as we call it, isn't always as well represented. Do they give enough time to sort of like fall back from that climax to sort of give the reader a sort of satisfying kind of follow up to that, and then the resolution or denouement is and it can be resolution, it can be a revelation, it can be a catastrophe at the end of the book. It doesn't have to be a happy ending, obviously, but I think people they seize upon the front part of the book. I mentioned earlier about prologues. People really like to put a prologue there, which is not always the best way of starting a novel. The opening of the book is so very, very important, and obviously the climax is important. You could have multiple climax points if you wanted in a book, but I think if you can try and view your book and your big picture structure and plot in the terms of, you know, does it have these basic elements of the story that we might want? And I think it's so important to the reader to have this sort of satisfying progression of stuff going on, you know, and it's going to involve a lot of conflict, a lot of pain, you know. We'll talk about putting the characters through pain and, you know, and making them you know, suffer to a certain extent through fiction, and that can be through anything from literary fiction to internal, you know, existential journeys, right through to, you know, purely action-based, you know, sword and sorcery fighting or spaceships blowing each other up. But I think you need to frame, I think, your story in this way to give a satisfying beginning, middle, and end for the reader. And I think Jim said brilliantly earlier on, you know, you don't want it to be this kind of series of books that's a cliffhanger ending necessarily. Even in a science fiction or fantasy epic, which is arguably in some ways a one big story told over multiple books, like a George R.R. Martin, you still want each book to have that sort of that beginning, middle, and end, so you can have a satisfied reader at the end of the book, one that isn't going, oh no, that's that. How did they end it on that? It can be very frustrating for readers, I think, if they get to the end and there isn't that sort of that final moment. So for me, always watch out for that beginning bit. Always don't forget when the climax isn't the end of the book, and that's really important, I think.
Yeah, and I think George R.R. Martin is the only one who who can afford to do all these cliffhanger endings on his books.
Yeah, I think some authors do like to end every chapter on a climax, and I always think that's a mistake. You know, if you've got a series of sort of climax or the cliffhanger ending, if every chapter ends on a cliffhanger ending to move the story along, it can be exhaustive for the reader almost. You know, and it's not always the best way of doing things. I don't think. I think you need a more well thought out, structured progression of the book. You know, you shouldn't have to rely on that idea of they must read on to find out what happens next because they're about to fall off the cliff. You know, I mean it doesn't make for a very satisfying read, I don't think, and I think that's so important as well.
No, agreed. It's a question. I think it's a question of pacing and also providing moments where the reader can breathe. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as you said, there's a lot of room for experimentation in modern fiction. But too often I have writers who are experimenting without kind of knowing the rules or knowing the traditional story arc, and that's when you're going to have problems. If you know the traditional story arc, if you've played with it, and if you want to take a modern twist on it, that's fine.
I think it might be Robert McKee's book, Story, which is more aimed at scriptwriters, but I think he says something along the lines of there are no rules in fiction, but there are conventions. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that you might want to experiment, but there are conventions, you know, especially if you're looking to get a book deal and you know, you're looking to get to agents and editors. I think I would never say don't experiment, but I would always say always keep in mind, always at the back of your mind, keep the sort of the basics there.
Absolutely. You know, just to add on to that, the idea behind the basics is they're not just simply the basics, they're the foundation. And just like when you're building a house, you know, you have to have that foundation. What comes up above the house, you know, how the house is physically built, that can change from house to house to house to house, and should. But you still have to have that foundation there, otherwise the house, you know, falls apart. It's the same thing with the story. And while you can of course and should experiment, you can't lose track of the foundation. More where the art of that experiment comes in is how well you hide the foundation within the story. Romantic comedies, you know, going quickly to film, and I realize we're talking about books, but the art in a romantic comedy is not necessarily in how original the story is. It's more how you're able to hide the basic convention of the romantic comedy, which is boy meets girl, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. So anyway.
No, I think you're right. I think that's why we keep going back to what are essentially classical examples of dramatic structure, isn't it? You know, I mean, there's a reason why even now we're still going back to you know, to the Greeks almost, you know, isn't it? It's
yeah.
And then I think to
And
try
there's an
and avoid that completely would be foolish, you know, especially for a new writer.
Absolutely, there's an excellent video by Kurt Vonnegut on different types of dramatic structures. It's very funny and also quite enlightening. I think we have it in the blog post around that. So quickly, 5 additional mistakes to watch out for. So I haven't attributed any editor to any of those. I know, Jim, you'll want to talk about formatting, but maybe if someone wants to talk about head hopping, go ahead.
I could say one thing that's kind of head hopping, but is more in line with confusing your narrator and your main character, that I see a lot. And this may be more relevant a little bit later on, but I do want to say it because I think it's a common mistake that I see, is that writers don't necessarily plan out their narrators the way they do their characters. I mean, your narrator is very much a character in your book, and you, at the very least, need to know your narrator's point of view, how they feel about the main character, why they're telling the situation, obviously assuming if it's not a first-person book, and their sort of position. I mean, are they calling out the main character when they do something stupid, or are they, you know, right there in line with them? Because if you don't have that sort of mapped out, then your narrator kind of ends up being all over the place. And I think that's a really important part of you know, point of view. And your narrator really does serve as a character in the book.
Just real quickly on head hopping, part of the problem with it is that if you hop from one head to another, basically you have one narrator, you know, one person through whom the reader is perceiving the scene, and then you switch to somebody else, you know, like they're in a conversation, and you know, you're going inside each of the characters' heads, you lose all the tension of that conversation. You lose all the tension of what's going on. In other words, if the reader knows exactly what is going on in each and every character's head at every single moment throughout the story, then where's the tension? Where's the potential confusion? Or if you do have that confusion come about, then the reader's left wondering, well, why was this person confused? I know exactly what's going on in this person's head. Why doesn't the other person? So it's more just simply a device to make sure that you keep tension, you keep the idea that, you know, your narrator is a camera, and, you know, you're only sticking with that one camera for a particular scene. And then if you switch to a different camera, you need to signal that in some way to the reader.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think a really good example of a book that I read recently that does an excellent job at it is Fabio Genovese, I think the author's name is. The book is called The Breaking of a Wave. And it just came out, I think, like maybe within the last 2 years by Europa. And he does a phenomenal job at doing different point of views for like 6 different characters, and each character is so distinct that within 2 sentences of a new chapter, because every new chapter is a new character's point of view, within those 2 sentences, you know exactly who is speaking. So I think that the sort of head hopping point of view thing is something that can be done at a really advanced stage, and it takes a tremendous amount of planning. It takes a whole slew of different language and expressions and way of speaking and syntax. All sorts have to be so different for each character, and it's a really difficult thing to pull off. But if anyone is doing that for their book, and they're interested in seeing a way that it's done, I really recommend The Breaking of a Wave.
I guess the only thing I'd probably add to that is I think you're both completely correct, and to just follow up on what Jim said. I think one of the pieces of advice I always give is, you know, if you want to have multiple narrative viewpoints, or multiple narrative focuses, however you want to call it. I mean, scene breaks are your friend. You know, I mean, to indicate a scene break, you know, use the star or the hashtag or whatever. The general rule I always suggest is you don't have, like Jim said, don't have two people in that sort of camera viewpoint. You know, don't swap from one to the other in the same scene. Give the reader a cue that you're swapping from one to the other. I guess it's probably worth mentioning the omniscient narrator, because I mean, technically, the omniscient narrator is the only focal point, narrative focal point in a book, but it does give you the opportunity to move between different characters' heads, because the omniscient can see everything, can tell you everything. The difficulty is it is really, really hard to do well. I mean, it is I think an advanced thing to do well. The one I read, it's not a new book, but I only read it last year. Slightly shamefaced to say that, but it was Empire Falls by Richard Russo, which obviously won the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, that's a wonderful example of the omniscient narrator done well, where he can move between narrative viewpoints somewhat more easily. On a more commercial level, I always thought John Sanford was really good at doing that as well. You know, he uses the omniscient in his crime thrillers, and he does that very, very well. But I mean, technically, that's not quite the same as the head hopping thing, but it's sort of an extension of the theme, which I think is kind of interesting. But again, it's, you know, like Jim said, let the reader know when you're swapping. It's you know, it avoids the confusion. Try and keep it one scene at a time. Use scene breaks. Use chapter breaks. Like George R.R. Martin again. You know, every chapter is a different character's name, pretty much, and that's kind of how he lets you know what he's doing. You know? So.
Yeah, and I think that's, so I've seen a big wave of a lot of authors doing multiple point of view in fantasy since George R.R. Martin. And what they don't realize is that first it's really tough to do, as Laura said, because each character needs to have a voice. So you need to be at a certain stage in your writing career where you can pull that off. And then he does use the name of each character as the name of the chapter, and that helps a lot, because otherwise, I think some readers would be lost. So if you're doing
crime novels do it quite well, not just John Sanford, but sometimes if you're having a book where you've got the criminal and the investigator's points of view alternating, I mean, that can work quite nicely as an idea. But again, you've got to know what you're doing to do it well. Otherwise, it just gets too confusing.
Excellent. Erin, do you want to take any one of these other topics there?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit on the disruptive dialogue tags, which is something that I see a lot. And this is something like just consistently saying he said or she said, when in actuality, probably the best way to follow up dialogue is just to use action from that character. If you can say you're talking about Jenny. Jenny says, "Hey, I really like your skirt." And then you can say something like, "Jenny looked down at her own skirt." You're showing so much more in that rather than just saying Jenny said, because now you're showing your reader that maybe Jenny's feeling a little bit insecure about her own skirt. And that's why she gave the compliment to a friend. So you can show so much more for the words if you just use action instead of he said or she said.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And there's also, I see a lot of writers using actually grammatically incorrect dialogue tags, as in facial expressions or verbs for facial expressions instead of actually speaking.
Yeah, I'm with Elmore Leonard, where he says, you know, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. I don't think you have to be completely obsessed with that, but I mean, I've had people using some very strange words, like pantomime. Pantomime. I'm like, what does that even look like? You know, I can kind of visualize it, but not in a good way. I think the idea of using some people call it like descriptive beats or descriptive tags, rather than using the dialogue tags, is really interesting. I guess the only thing I'd say is, if you've got a lot of people having involved in a conversation at the same time, like say 2 or 3 characters all talking together, I think that's where dialogue tags can be helpful to keep the reader aware of who's saying what. I do see quite a lot of confused dialogue in that kind of way. So I think, again, if you're starting out writing, I think you can, if you rely on that at least to an extent, if you've got multiple people talking, and interrupting each other and that kind of thing, I think that's always a useful point for people as well.
Well, ultimately, the dialogue tag, you really kind of have to think of it as it's something you want the reader to ultimately ignore. It needs to be invisible. And, that's, Michael is absolutely right. Where people are using a lot of weird words and words that aren't necessarily words of speech in their dialogue tags. And all that does is it just draws attention to the dialogue tag, which ultimately you don't want them paying attention to. And it also, speaks to what we were talking earlier about showing or telling rather than showing. Is I see a lot of authors who want their dialogue tags to do too much. That it's not necessarily Jenny spoke quickly. Why not, Jenny replied, not pausing in between the words. That does so much more. But even still, that's trying to have your dialogue tag, do way too much. I think Aaron had the right idea that, Aaron's advice is definitely much stronger, where you just simply have the dialogue and then you have the action following it. By having, by saying that Jenny is doing this particular action, it does the job of a dialogue tag, but does so much more than just simply, being a dialogue tag.
It might be worth saying as well that dialogue punctuation is quite specific as well, like the rules. I suppose it's one of the things where there are rules, grammatical rules about what you shouldn't do, and a lot of people don't. I think because a lot of people, everyone pretty much writing, they've read a lot of books, they think they know what the rules are, and so start writing, but actually, they use commas where they should be using periods, and periods where they should be using commas, and I think that's a really basic thing somebody can go and do, is just go and have a quick look at the rules of dialogue punctuation. I mean, unless you're Cormac McCarthy and you're just going to say, I'm not going to use any dialogue punctuation at all, which I secretly think is because he still types on a typewriter, but and it's just less keys to press. But it's so obvious in the writing when you see people doing that wrong. That's another thing I think an agent or an editor will notice, a lack of basic sort of grammatical understanding of how to do it if you're going to do it. But as Jim said, it's often, sometimes it's, I know, better not to do it. But I think making sure those really, and it's really basic, the punctuation dialogue stuff. It's just knowing when to use which piece of punctuation, I think, is so important for it.
Yeah, as an agent, I'll go ahead and agree with that completely. That's maybe one of the first indicators of a writer that is not ready to have an agent yet. Yeah,
because it takes about half an hour to learn it properly. If you go on, there's websites with great links. It's really not difficult. You don't have to go and buy the Oxford New Style manual or whatever. It's really simple to learn it, but so many people don't actually check before they do it. And I always say to writers, I think, if I'm doing a line edit, I'll say, well, I'm going to correct the first couple of chapters for you, and explain what you should be doing. Then I think you need to go through and do it yourself, because essentially, if you keep changing them yourself back to how they should be, then you'll never forget how to do it again. It's practice, isn't it? But yeah, basic grammar at the end of the day.
Perfect. So we're going to stick to, we're running short on time, so we're going to stick to one editor per remaining tip for these 5. So maybe, I don't know, Laura, do you want to talk about the misuse of tense?
Yeah, this can be sort of an easy fix, I think. If you go through your manuscript and you focus just on tense, it becomes quite easy to see when you're veering off from what your story is doing. And actually, a lot of times before I start working with an author, I always ask, what's the tense of your story? And, sometimes people say to me, well, that's kind of a dumb question. You'll be able to see it within the first paragraph, right? But it's actually not, because a lot of authors jump back and forth. And then, so I'll be reading and I'll be following along and I'll think that, you know, this story is happening in the past tense, but then they'll sort of continue on in the present tense for kind of a while, and they'll sort of dip in and out of past and present tense. And to the point where I've gotten through chapters and I've been like, wait a minute, I've not noticed until now, maybe that they've switched it twice, because maybe, you know, maybe the writing is good and it's smooth and it's rolling along, and then you get to one detail and you're like, wait a minute, something is completely wrong. So then I have to sort of go back and I have to look at just the tenses, and I'm like, oh, here's the exact point where the mistake was made. And you know, I think that's sort of an easy fix, because you just go through and you just make sure that if you mean to tell your story in the present tense, that every single word is in the present tense. You know, there are sort of variations for that are probably too complicated and long to get into. But just the general rule is like, stick to present tense if you're doing present tense, and go through and look for that.
Perfect. And Jim, you wanted to talk about formatting.
Yeah. One of the things that I tend to notice in a lot of the manuscripts that I get is the formatting is all over the place, you know, where they're not indenting paragraphs. They put a paragraph space in between every paragraph. You know, things aren't indented, you know, manuscripts, much like any other, you know, piece of, submitted work. Screenplays are a great example of this, you know, where if you don't format your screenplay properly, it's not going to be read. It's, you know, it's one of the initial things that somebody looks for to figure out whether or not they're dealing with someone who not only knows their craft, but also knows the rules of their craft. And manuscript formatting is the same thing. You know, it needs to be double spaced. It needs to, you know, you need to indent each paragraph. You put in a page break at the end of a chapter, not a whole bunch of returns that then set up the next chapter opener. You know, it's little things, but those little things can mean a lot, particularly when it's going to an agent, or, you know, even more important, going to an editor. Not necessarily one of us, but, an editor at a publishing house, that, you know, they want to know that they're dealing with somebody who is a professional and who knows the basic rules of how this stuff is supposed to be put together. And it's really a very simple thing. I mean, most of the word processing programs out there, you know, Microsoft Word, Final Draft, they all have a basic template for a book manuscript. Start there. It seems kind of, sorry, the word is failing me. It seems kind of pedantic. You know, it seems, you know, like it, you know, you're adhering too much to the rules, but it's really just such a basic thing, and it's so easy to do. And it puts your manuscript on the right foot.
Yeah, and because otherwise it's just such a pain for the editor who's doing it. It makes it just such tedious work, and it's just, they spend so much time then just fixing your formatting, which is not what you want them to be focused on.
Exactly. It's like what we were talking about with some of these other things. You know, more what you want to have an editor or an agent focusing on is your story and how you tell it and the level of your craft. You don't want them to be paying attention to, God, the formatting is really bad. They're not punctuating their dialogue tags properly, all that sort of stuff. You know, you want them to be focused on not the mechanics of how you put together the manuscript. You want them to be focused on how the story works. Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. And so that goes a little bit together with dialogue punctuation in general. Cool. So we've talked about big picture issues. We've talked about small mechanicals, so that they don't distract the agents and the editors from the big picture. Now we're going to go more in detail into each section of the book and which sections in particular you should be paying attention to. Let's start with obviously the beginning. I think, Erin.
Yeah, so I'm just going to speak about this from an agent's perspective. The first 10 or so pages of your novel are the first thing that the agent is going to read. So if you spend any time on your novel at all, if you get an editor to help you with your novel, but maybe you can't spend enough to get the whole novel done, try and get those 10 pages to be perfect, because those are really the first impression. And maybe once they read those, they're going to want to get the whole manuscript. And they might see little things that are off, little grammatical things in the next pages that are off. But their first impression was that it was so good that they're going to overlook those small grammatical errors. So really make sure that you're fine-tuning those first 10 pages or so.
Laura, do you want to talk about the pivotal scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Erin that those first 10 pages are extremely important. I mean, you know, writers are probably, if you're signed up for any sort of writing list, you're probably constantly on emails about, you know, work with an agent to, you know, make sure those first 10 pages are in order. I completely agree, because if you can hook an agent, they're already going to like you. If they've read the first 10 pages and they like it, then they want to like the book. They're rooting for the book. So that's extremely important. But, you know, that's not to say that the rest of the book is not important as well. And I think that it has to be mostly complete. And like I said before, you know, you've got to have things happening in the storyline. Things have to happen to the character. You have to put the character through difficult situations, have him make tough decisions. Because without that, you know, an agent wants to root for a book, but if it just doesn't sort of carry its weight, then, you know, the agent is not going to be able to sign it or to sign you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the advice of looking at the beginning of the novel is a bit everywhere, and still it's overlooked. But once the agent requests a full manuscript, you need to make sure that the rest, obviously, the manuscript is as good as what you showed in the beginning.
Yeah, and I just want to say one also important point that I think that, right, I mean, from my personal experience working with a specific writer, you know, if somehow an agent finds you, and I'm sort of linking this to short stories, like let's say you publish a short story in a magazine, agents read literary magazines, they find you, an agent contacts you and wants to know if you have a book. This has happened to a writer I've worked with in my magazine. It's better to say, you know what, I'm still working on my book. Can I get back to you in 6 months with the full manuscript? Instead of giving them sort of some half-assed, you know, book that you're still working on. An agent will remember you. One chance. I think that writers get really eager to just get something out there, and it's a huge mistake. And it's okay to say, yes, I have a book, but I'm still working on it, and I need a little bit of time. And I think it's a really crucial step for somebody's career.
Absolutely. And now, Michael, if you want to talk about the denouement, you talked a little bit about it earlier, but it's true that's one of the places was in the narrative arc that authors don't pay attention to.
Yeah, I think as just to expand on what I said earlier, you know, I think people get to the climax of the book and they kind of go, whoa, okay, it's finished. that's good. We've got to the end, and they either skip straight to the sort of the denouement, which would be the, you know, the final, you know, sort of ending of the book, whether it is a resolution or a revelation or whatever it might be, but they do tend to forget this bit between whatever the climax might be and the end of the book. And usually there is a sort of a cause and effect, a natural kind of flow of the story, and some loose ends that you probably want to tie up, or people just thinking about what's happened, the characters just thinking or processing what's happened in a climax. And of course the climax could be it could be an emotional climax, it could be an action-based climax. There's all sorts of different kinds. But I think I often see, you hit what essentially is the big peak of the book, and then you've got maybe a chapter or two is the most you'll see. Now that can work you know, in theory, depending on the book, but I would say always think about that gap between the climax and the denouement of the book. And some people like to have an epilogue, which would serve as a denouement. Some people, you know, some people don't, and obviously it's not necessary to call it an epilogue, much like, you know, what I said earlier about prologues. But I think, you know, if you concentrate on these ideas of, you know, what kind of internal and external sort of conflicts have happened, and do the characters need to process through that in some way, or just tie up those loose ends, I think it's so important to make sure that bit of the book is a satisfying kind of like end to things. I think Jim mentioned films earlier on, and I think that's another way. I mean, you have the big explosion scene in an action movie. You don't just stop the film there. You know, there's usually a little bit of character stuff going on at the end, and I think that's a good way of thinking of it. You know, there's usually room to finish off the character's journey. You know, if it's one protagonist, you know, let the hero go on that journey. Let them have their you know, their cooling down period before they hit that final moment. And so often I just don't see it. I just don't see that bit of the book. So I think it's really important to think about that, and try and work out what happens after you hit that peak. So I think that for me is just really important.
No, I totally agree. Especially, I mean, we've been talking about what publishers want, what agents want, and obviously that focuses a lot on the beginning of the novel. But once your book is published, once it's out there, it needs to leave the readers with a good taste when they get to the end. Especially if you're going to ask them for a review, or if you're going to ask them to sign up to your newsletter, or if you just want them to pass on your book, spread word of mouth. The ending is so important, and the denouement, and it's true that's something that not a lot of authors pay attention to, and it's something that I don't see mentioned enough in writing craft, writing advice.
I think what Jim said earlier about killing characters as well is an interesting view. Often you'll get death or some sort of tragedy at the end of a book, maybe. I mean, not necessarily. It could be a romantic comedy, you know, or something like that again. But I think, you know, there's a real opportunity there for some great writing, you know, at the end of the book. And I think if you miss that out, it's just such a shame. You know, like you said just then, it's not something people talk about often enough, I think.
Absolutely. So Aaron, just quickly, if you need to go, no problem. We're running a bit late. For everyone else, we're gonna have a quick Q&A afterwards. And now, Jim, I'll let you talk about the outline.
I mean, we've touched on a lot of this throughout the presentation, but you know, I'll just go back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of foundation. You know, you need to have that foundation, you know, for the whole thing to work, and that foundation is going to be your outline. That's your where you say, this is what happens at the beginning, this is what happens in the middle, this is what happens at the end. You know, taking into account all the things that we've been talking about. You know, what Aaron was talking about in terms of the beginning, what Laura was talking about in terms of the pivotal scenes that happen in the middle, and then what Michael was talking about in terms of the end. All of that has to be reflected in your outline. That is your roadmap. That's what you use to guide you as you not only write the novel, but then also as you go back to rewrite the novel, because in rewriting the novel, you may also be restructuring the outline. You know, that happens from time to time. But at the end of the day, you need that foundation, and you need to make sure that all the scenes that you hang on that outline contribute to moving the plot forward. It can't be anything that's extraneous. You know, again, getting back to the idea of series, where it's like, oh, I'm putting this scene in because I need it to, you know, set up the series. Well, if it's not moving the plot forward in book one, you know, then it isn't helping you. You know, you can certainly hint to things that may come in later books, but you can't have an entire, but be careful about having an entire scene revolve around this idea that you're not even going to develop until, you know, book 2, 3, or worse, 4 or 5.
Absolutely. So now we're gonna focus a little bit more on the rounds of revisions, because obviously we've mentioned a lot of things in the past few slides, and we've given pointers on both big picture stuff, mechanical stuff. You can't focus on all of that in one round of revision, one rewrite, one editing pass. So the question becomes, how many rounds should you do, and what should you focus on? And Jim, you can carry on that.
I say here at least 1, 2 is better, but end of the day, you do as many as you need to do. It's more just simply that you want to make sure that rewriting doesn't become a continual process where, it's like, well, I've rewritten it once, but I'm going to go back and rewrite it again. And then I'm going to rewrite it again. And then I'm going to rewrite it again. Yes, you are going to do a whole bunch of rewrites. That's just something that you have to accept. But more what you need to do is give yourself a goal in terms of a number of rewrites that you want to do before you start showing it to people. And when I say show it to people, I'm talking about like beta readers, maybe start, querying editors to see if they, people like us, to see whether or not we'd be willing to work with you to help you smooth out the rough patches, that sort of thing. But don't put yourself into this endless cycle of rewrites before you even start showing it around.
Yeah, and Michael, you're offering kind of a quick template for example, how one could go about revising, right?
Yeah, sure. I think, like Jim said, I think you should do at least one, at least one round of revisions, where you look at that big picture stuff. You look at the plot, the structure, the character. Does it all work? Does it hang together? Is there continuity, and all those kind of things that we've talked about earlier on, I guess. And I think if you're going to be sending it out straight to agents and publishers, I think you definitely need to do that second round of just the basics, the grammar, the punctuation, the formatting, like we talked about, especially if you're sending it out straight to publishers, because they aren't going to want to see something that isn't, industry standard to an extent. And agents as well, they want to be able to see that you have a high level of technical skill. At the end of the day, that you can write and you know what you're doing. And also it's really just doing your due diligence on that front. So I'd say at least one, like Jim said, for rereading through and making any changes that might need, and then I'd say another go through just to look at those sort of technical points. I don't think you should worry too much about the technical points when you're doing your substantial big picture stuff. If you're writing, right, if you need to rewrite, and obviously try and pick up things as you go along on the technical side of things if you're still learning. But before you send it out, definitely I would try and do that. And as Jim said, if at that point, if you think you want to approach beta readers or freelancers or whatever to take it to the next level, especially if you're self-publishing, then I think that's probably your third step, I guess.
No, absolutely. And we're going to get into beta readers right now, because obviously there's a point where probably you need to start revising and hand it out to beta readers and editors. And that's actually one of the questions I get very often, authors who sign up to Reedsy and they're finishing their novel and they're saying, when do I know when to start revising and when to hire an editor? When does it make sense to involve an editor? And I really like Laura's advice on this, because a lot of times authors worry about over-revising, but you're saying that it's not something you should worry too much about.
No, in my experience, I've not worked with a writer who's over-revised to the point where it destroyed this, the story. I think that, if you're serious about, the potential of your book, I really think that you should work with different editors at different stages. You should get an editorial assessment to sort of measure the structure as a whole, what's working, what's not, where to put attention, the character development, etc. After that revision, you should go for another revision, more of a developmental edit that focuses on language as well, and gets just a little bit more focus in the book. And then, of course, a line edit. Now, I understand that's not really available to everyone because you're going to be spending, $10,000 to $15,000 just on the editing process of your book. But the point is that it's a serious revision process, and it's great to have friends read your book and give you feedback, but sometimes that's really not enough. I think it's very important to work with an editor, to revise it as much as you can, figure out your budget for your book, what you're working with. Reach out to a bunch of editors, talk to them, see their approach, get a couple quotes, and sort of see from that, from talking to people, what's your best approach, how much you can do on your own before you hand it off to a professional, which is going to cost you a little bit of money. But I really wouldn't worry about over revising, because I think that, like Jim says here, that you'll always find something to fix. There's always something to improve. There's a really great quote by the poet Charles Simic. That's something like, he'll be tinkering his poems as he's lowered into the grave. I mean, there's always something to make better. So yeah, I wouldn't really worry about it so much.
Real quickly on picking an editor, Laura makes some really good points in terms of, do your due diligence, query more than just one editor, but also make sure that you're querying the editors for the right kind of edit. Oftentimes what tends to happen, particularly, or sometimes happens here on the Reedsy network, is, somebody will come to me asking for a proofread when they really need a developmental edit. And unfortunately I've had to turn down projects specifically because of that, that they're asking for the wrong level of edit. It's true, it's not an inexpensive process, but don't necessarily, go for essentially the cheap way out, because you think, well, if I ask them to do a proofread, they'll also help me clean up story stuff. Well, that's not what a proofread is for. It's better that, you take the time, maybe spend some more time with the manuscript yourself and save up the extra money that you need to do that developmental edit or do a copy edit, rather than just simply, trying to go for I'd say, a cheap and easy way to get your book edited.
Yeah, because it's like you've put so many months or years into writing the book. You've already invested so much of yourself and your time. And I think, you really got to go full force and figure, it may take you years to raise the funds that you need to properly do the book, but, do yourself that justice and do the book that justice. And, that's what I think a lot of writers don't understand, is they don't sort of view the time they've invested as money. They're just sort of like looking at the basic dollar amounts. So, do what's right for yourself in your book,
I think it's for people like ourselves, like industry professionals as well. We're so used to the way things are done and the process and where each bit of the process comes in traditional publishing in particular. So like you'd have your developmental edit, and then you'd have your copy edit, and then it'd be typeset, and then it'd be proofread, and then it's a book, and even the simple distinctions like that, I think, new writers don't necessarily understand the sort of the best way of doing it, and the stages they should perhaps go through. So I think that's another thing that, like Jim said, people will approach you to get pieces work done that maybe not quite appropriate for whatever reason. And I think one of the things that we as the professionals, is one of the things we need to do is make sure that the feedback we give initially is, well, maybe you don't want this, maybe you need that, because it is difficult if you're not in the industry and you don't know.
Absolutely. That's why I love, that the Reedsy has that FAQ page that really lays out every step of of editing that they offer and what it entails. And I think that a lot of writers do contact me, and it seems they haven't read that, because they'll sort of check all the boxes that they're looking for: an assessment, a developmental edit, a copy edit, and a proofread. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're just one step at a time. Like, check out the FAQ page and come back to me and tell me like what resonates with you most, and we'll work from there. So definitely, I think writers should check out that Reedsy FAQ page, because it's exactly what you need, and then you know exactly what we're talking about and the differences between the levels of editing.
And Aaron gave some good advice earlier, where you can always come to us and say, you know what, I can't afford to do my entire book right now, but I really kind of want to get an idea as to whether or not I'm on the right track. Are you willing to do an edit of a chapter or something like that? And of course we are, because we're here to help. And that's why we do this. And So of course, we'd be willing to do a chapter, because also, there's an incentive for us as well, is because if you like the edit that we do on the chapter, then when you get farther along, that you'll come and talk to us again, and we'll continue to work with you. So, don't necessarily be daunted by the idea of, well, to edit my 100,000 word manuscript is going to cost X dollars, and then you have sticker shock. Say, well, what if we did an edit of my 3,000 word first chapter? Then it becomes a very different conversation.
Absolutely. Well, we're about to get into hiring editors right now. Aaron, if you're still around, don't hesitate to jump in at any point, by the way. So yeah, how and when to involve beta readers and editors. So this is an advice from an editor who's not on the panel today, but I like to use that quote in pretty much any presentation I give that involves hiring, working with beta readers and hiring editors. And we talked about this, but I'm going to say it again. Do not send a first draft to a freelance editor or even to a beta reader. The whole time we've been talking about revision, these are things that you should strive to do yourself before you pass on the manuscript to an editor. And the reason for that is you don't want to spend your money on an editor catching things that you could have coded on your own. And then you pass it on to a beta reader, because you don't necessarily want to spend your money on an editor catching things that a team of beta readers could have coded. And then you hire an editor, and that's when you get the most value for your money. So, quick tips on finding the right editor, where Jim talked about that earlier. You really want to find someone who resonates with you, with your genre, with your story, someone who is proficient in the type of editing you're looking for. And we're going to go into that in more detail in just a second. I'm going to show you a snippet of our FAQ page that Laura talked about. And obviously, you should either use reputable websites like Reedsy, or ask for testimonials and recommendations from other authors or industry experts. And then definitely do a background check on all the editors that you query. So on Reedsy, we display the profiles of the editors. You've got their work experience. You've got all the books that they've worked on. So it's very easy to do that background check. It's right there in one page. If you hire someone outside of Reedsy, what they're going to display on their website is only good stuff about them. So you're going to need to find other sources of information, maybe interact, ask some of the other authors they've worked with in the past, ask them on Twitter what they thought about the experience, see what their work experience has been in the past, if they work for traditional publishers, and things like that. So do a background check. And then when you found these editors you want to reach out for, another important thing is, especially if you're going to submit to publishers and agents, do these editors, these freelance editors you're querying, do they have traditional publishing experience? So here on the panel today, we've got one literary agent, we've got a former production editor, we've got a former literary magazine editor, we've got a former editorial director. So all the people you're going to find on Reedsy in general, they're going to have a lot of traditional publishing experience. So that's the kind of editor you want if you're going to go, especially if you're going to go down the traditional publishing route. Now, in terms of how you reach out to them, first, you need to know what type of editing you're after. Again, we'll get into that in a second. Then, obviously, you attach a sample of your book, your whole book, and you indicate what your genre is, who your target market is, and a short synopsis. And I've highlighted target market there because I often look at Reedsy requests, and that's the one thing that drives me nuts, is that maybe only one writer in 100 is able to describe who the target market is. And if you're not able to describe that to your freelance editor, how are you going to be able to describe that to a literary agent you're going to send a query to? How are you even going to be able to identify which literary agents to send your manuscript to? So really know who your target market is. And that's more than just like women between the ages of 30 and 45. That's not a target market. You need to use comparable authors, subgenres, and things like that to pinpoint exactly where you're going to place that book in the market. Timing, it's very important to bear in mind that the good editors, they're booked out months in advance. So don't don't set a publishing date, a publishing deadline for your book before you reach out to editors, because you don't necessarily know when they're going to be available. And the fact that they're not available right away is actually a good sign. It's because they've got a lot of business, because they're good. And all of our developmental editors on Reedsy, they're booked out 2-3 months in advance. It can vary, but like, take that into account. And again, don't send in your first draft for developmental editing. Now here's a little table that Laura was talking about. It's in our FAQ page. I'll send the link. I'll put the link in the YouTube description below the video, so everyone can have a look at the whole FAQ page. It also contains sample edits that shows exactly what a copy edit looks like, what a proofread looks like, what a developmental edit looks like. I'm not going to get into each stage of editing, because we've talked about those in the previous slides. However, what I'm going to say is, if this is your first book, or your first book in a new genre, you've revised it, get an editor for an editorial assessment first. And I mean, I've changed that advice over the years, but right now I'm just leaning totally towards the editorial assessment, because a lot of authors don't know exactly what kind of edit they're going to need. And if it's your first book or the first time you write in that genre, just get a manuscript evaluation, hire an editor to read through your manuscript and do a one-off report, write you an editorial letter that's going to describe what you're doing well, what you're doing less well. Maybe one of you wants to explain what you include in an editorial assessment. That will give the audience a better idea of what that is.
I do editorial assessments, and also with the developmental edits, I also include an overview of the edit that is very similar to an assessment. What I tend to talk about is, I'll talk about the plot, I'll talk about pacing, I'll talk about character arcs, and I will try and point out some of the grammatical errors and that sort of thing. Also, I'll point out if I drifted off, if I try with an editorial assessment to read the entire book, but I'm not able to get through all of these books. And if there comes a point where I drift off, where I lose my interest, I do let them know that. Because as we've been talking, you have to have that hook. You have to keep that reader engaged from page 1 to the very end. So it is a very broad strokes kind of thing. And getting back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of cost, generally for most editors, it's one of the less expensive services that we offer. So, if your budget is tight, but you do want to get an idea of what's working, what's not, an editorial assessment is a good fallback. But as with anything else, realize that editorial assessments take time. It's not something where we can, like read through your book in a week. Again, we've got other stuff on our desks. So generally allow at least a month, if not 2, particularly depending on how long the book is, for an editor to get back to you with their assessment.
Perfect. And one thing I'd say is, don't look at the right side of the table, copy editing, proofreading, until you've had a developmental editor perform either an editorial assessment or a developmental edit on your book. Because in most cases, it's going to be kind of a waste of money. Because let's say you get a copy editor to remove all the grammatical errors. We mentioned dialogue, punctuation, grammar. If they remove all of that, and then you publish your book, and you realize through reviews or because someone tells you that you've got a plot hole, you're going to have to rewrite maybe 1 chapter, 2 chapters. And the copy edit the money you'll have spent on a copy editor copy editing these 2 chapters, you'll have to spend it again, because you'll have to rewrite these chapters. So doing these in the wrong order is basically just going to be a waste of money. And I know often money is tight for writers, so there's a reason there's an order for this. There's a reason why all of the editors on the panel have mentioned know what kind of editing you're after, and especially trust us if we tell you at your stage it'd be better to invest your money in an editorial assessment or a developmental edit. Talking about money, The great thing about Reedsy is that we've been running for 3.5 years now. So we've got kind of an idea of how much all these services cost. And it's not just like an arbitrary idea. It's we've analyzed all the quotes that have come in through our marketplace, so thousands of quotes based on the types of service the editor was quoting for and the manuscript length the author had indicated. So you can get an idea of average prices. Now, some of the editors on Reedsy are going to charge a lot more than that for a developmental edit on a novel. Some are going to charge slightly less, but this can help you budget at least what you should set aside for editing. We've recently done a study by genre, so again, I'll put the link in the description. We've done an analysis through genre, and it varies also a lot from genre to genre. Developmental edit on a romance book tends to be cheaper. Developmental edit on a historical fiction tends to be more expensive because there's going to be fact-checking involved. And it's also down to the editors who perform those. So it's quite interesting. I'll put the link and you can take a look. But again, the best thing is log on Reedsy and ask quotes from editors, and they'll give you a quote directly for you and your manuscript, because it can vary a lot depending on how clean your manuscript is. So we've talked a lot about Reedsy, so I have to say something about what we do. We're basically a creative community. So we've got 50,000 authors all around the world, and we've got 800 professionals. So that's editors, cover designers, book marketers, ghostwriters on our marketplace. So it's a lot of authors, not a lot of professionals. What you need to know is that we actually have a lot more professionals. We've had over 25,000 applications from freelancers who wanted to be listed on Reedsy, and the particularity of Reedsy is that we pay really close attention to whom we allow on our marketplace. So the kind of editors who are on the panel today are the kind of editors they're going to see on Reedsy: people with traditional publishing experience, people who've been in this industry for a while, and people who've worked often on best-selling books and with best-selling authors, people who know what they're doing. So this is why, on average, we only accept around 3% of applications from freelancers who want to be listed on the platform, which is, I guess, why a lot of authors come to us for editing or even for cover design. And as you know, as you can see, we like to do a few webinars to help authors prepare themselves for the editing stage, especially when it comes to manuscript revision. So, as I mentioned, you can just log into Reedsy, search by genre, even by keyword, pinpoint really the professionals you're interested in. Have a look at their work experience, have a look at the books in their portfolio, see if you're probably going to recognize familiar names in there, and then identify 3-5 editors you want to reach out to. Give yourself choice. Don't pick just one. And then send them your brief, send them your request, and generally they'll answer within 48 hours. They're not, just warning, they're not all gonna send you a quote within 48 hours saying, "I'd love to work on your manuscript." Most requests only get maybe 2-3 quotes. First, because our editors are busy, and also because sometimes they just might not be interested in your manuscript, or they might judge that you're not at the stage for the type of editing you're after. So a lot of reasons why an editor might decline your requests. It's not necessarily a bad sign. A last thing I want to mention about Reedsy, because we've been working a lot on this, is our series of free courses. So we launched that in October 2016, and we've got 31 courses now, 27,000 students enrolled. So it's just email courses. You sign up for any one of our courses, and you'll get one email every day for 10 days on the topic of the course you selected. So Laura, for example, has an amazing course on short stories, how to write a killer short story. So you'll find it in the writing section here. We don't have anything right now in the editing section, but we're about to add 3 courses on revision from 3 partners of ours that are going to be really good. So watch out for there. And then we've got some solid stuff in marketing as well. If you've got books out there that aren't selling well, definitely check out the marketing section. Now, so we talked a lot about hiring editors. We talked a lot about Reedsy. So as all, thank you for those of you who've been watching so far and still there. Here's a link that will give you $25 of credits if you sign up through it. So I put a deadline there. It's January 31st, 2018. So you've got around 14, let's say 13, 14 days left to sign up. What's important to know is you just need to sign up to get the credits. You don't need to send a request to editors. You don't need to hire an editor. You just need to sign up. When you sign up, this little credit's going to be in your account. It's going to sit there forever, or at least until you use it. And then if you hire an editor, let's say 1 month, 1 year, 2 years from now, that's going to act as a discount from the quote that you accept. So take advantage of the link. If you're not signed up to Reedsy, if you're signed up to Reedsy already, drop me a line, and we'll add that little credit to your account. And obviously, you'll find our 4 panelists on the Reedsy marketplace. You can search for them by name. Cool. So final tips, because I don't want to end on too Reedsy a note. I want to end on a note with some final tips for revision. Erin, if you're back, if you're around, you can definitely start.
Yeah, I think this is probably the most important thing to know about publishing, is that it takes a really long time. If you're looking, the second that you get an agent, which in itself can take nearly 2 years, a year, 2 years. Once you get an agent, that process is going to be even longer. Once you get a publisher, from the second that you sign your deal, it's probably going to be about 2 years before that book is even on the shelf. So you're not looking at something that's, going to take a couple of months, and you should put in an equivalent amount of work into that process to know that this is a big thing, and it takes a lot of time and for everybody involved.
Absolutely, and it goes back to what I was saying. Don't be afraid to put your manuscript aside for a few weeks after you've written it. Don't be afraid to do several revision passes on it. Don't be afraid to spend time on it, because traditional publishing takes a long time, and so you should put the same amount of time in writing and perfecting your manuscript. Jim, what's your final tip?
Mine is just simply how the discipline of writing itself, where, as I say there, start your writing day by rereading and punching up the pages that you worked on the previous day. I find it to be really helpful. It gets you back in the mindset that you were in when you were doing those previous pages, and you're already doing a little bit of a rewrite as you're progressing on. And, being in the right mind frame is a lot of it.
Perfect. Laura, what's your final tip?
It's better to produce 1 great book or 1 great short story than 2 mediocre ones. I really, really can't stress that enough. I've worked with writers who didn't agree, and I think some of their work has suffered for it. Put the time into writing your book. Don't think that you can produce 3 novels in a year. Yes, there are people who do it, but it takes an extremely, extremely talented writer to do that. And I think that you're much better off if you take it slowly, cover all the bases, and put out a single book that's really powerful. There are a lot of really well-known writers who write a book every 10 years, and their books are they knock him out of the park. That's the kind of writer I think that you should strive to be, instead of a writer who has produced 50 books and they're all just okay.
Absolutely, and it's true that especially in indie publishing, there's a lot of push towards putting out as much content as possible, and I think there's a limit to that.
Yeah, because if a reader, especially with self-publishing, if a reader reads your book and wasn't that impressed with it, they're not going to read your second book or your third. And if, same with short stories. And if you give them something that really wowed them, then they're going to be waiting and they're going to be eager to read your next book, whether it takes, a year or 2 years for you to put it out.
Perfect. Michael, use a spell check program. That's a solid advice.
It's, I think, yeah, I suppose it's part of a larger idea of, what you strive towards is a good story well told, but at the end of the day, don't forget the basics. And sometimes you get things from authors and they've turned off things like the spell and grammar check on Word, and you kind of think, why isn't that word showing up? And then you have to go in and change the settings to put it back on. And I'm always puzzled when I find spelling mistakes in manuscripts using modern technology. It's so speaking as somebody who's made their fair share of spelling mistakes in his day, but I think remember the basics. Use the tools at your disposal. Obviously, this is the kind of the last thing you want to do before you send it out to somebody is just do those basic things. But keep an eye on your punctuation and your grammar and all that kind of stuff, and your spelling and your word usage and everything. It's such a silly thing to say in a way, but actually at the end of the day, an agent isn't, or a publisher isn't going to want to look at your book if you've got a lot of basic errors in it. So while the big picture and the story and the plot and all those great things and the characters that you want to grab people with are so very important, don't forget the little things at the end of the day. I guess that's the point.
Cool. So, well, it's been 1 hour and a half instead of 1 hour, but that's how it always is almost with these webinars. So now we're going to move into Q&A. Before we move into that, remember the little link for $25. So again, it will be open until January 31st for signups. And here you've got my email address. I said several times, if you want to drop me a line, there you go. If you don't have Twitter typically and you want to use email instead. So now questions. So I've had someone in the background, thanks Yvonne, taking notes of different questions that were posted. So I'm just gonna fire them to the members of the panel. And this is probably, as it's around agents, from Kristen Donahue. It's probably for you, Erin. How long should you wait to hear from an agent before you assume the answer is no?
They generally have guidelines on their website how long it takes them to get back, or if they get back to you at all. So look at their website for that kind of guideline. If there are none, I think an appropriate amount of time to wait is about 2 months, and then send a very kind, not mean or too direct email about how you sent your query 2 months ago and you were just wondering if they got it. And if they don't respond to that, I wouldn't follow up further.
And is it appropriate to query 2 agents at the same agency for the same project?
Again, that follows guidelines for every agency. It's different. So look on their website. If it doesn't say anything, I'm assuming you can query more than one.
Cool, thank you. Question on editing now. So we've got Itzwell, who says, I find myself always revising the text I already have instead of writing new things and actually progressing in my story. How can I address this? So it's a question of like over revising, I guess. So who's gonna? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say try your hardest to just keep moving and get the story out. When I write, it's the same thing. I often feel like I want to go back and make sure every sentence is perfect. I think Cesar Ira is a writer who does that. He'll sit and he won't move on to the next sentence until the last one is perfect. But I think that's really damaging to your story. Get it out. Just get everything out. That can be the hardest part, and I think that's why writers are kind of hesitant to do it. But then once you have everything out, then go back and revise it, and it'll be a lot easier, a lot less stressful, and a lot more productive.
And just following up on what I was talking about earlier with the idea of going back and work, taking another look at what you did the previous day, that gives you, it gives you a window. You're not going back to page 1 and, when you're on page 300 and rewriting everything, you're going back maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 pages, looking at that and then progressing on.
Perfect. So, yeah, and one thing that I've heard, found really interesting, especially at a writers' conference, was a group of writers who just set up a timer, 15 minutes, and they did a sprint, and they just had to get as many words on the page as possible in 15 minutes. It's a bit extreme as an approach, but it makes sure that you're not revising at all, you're just writing.
Actually, that's actually an interesting one, because it's actually a creative copywriting tool as well. That if you're writing, say, back cover copy for a book, you do three versions in 15 minutes and time yourself and give yourself that really strict kind of thing. And as an extension of that for creative writing as well, it's a well-known and well-respected way of doing things. It can be really useful.
Cool. So we've got Charles Pucha, who asks, can you comment on developmental editors and how to know when to go to them over the other types of editors? So classical question of, how do I know when I need a developmental editor?
Go ahead.
So I personally think that all first drafts can use a good developmental edit. I think every editor is different. Like, I work in the terms where if I'm looking at a book where they said they needed developmental edits, but I think it's all structurally sound and the story is working, I'll work more intensely and focused on the writing. And I think that's a good thing to talk about your editor with, and say, maybe, I don't know exactly what stage my book is at. I don't know if I need copy edits or developmental edits, and just talk to them about it. Be open, and they can decide for you and say, oh yeah, I can help you with that, or I'll decide once I get into it. And yeah, just keep it as an open conversation with them.
And a question for you, Jim, regarding formatting, are there many editing apps we could use to help with this?
I don't have as much experience with apps. The thing is that it, using a basic template as a starting place is really the easiest way to do it. Like I said, Word comes with a template. Final Draft comes with a template. I'm sure that pretty much any major word processing program comes with a template that they call book manuscript. And if you're already well into your book and you're not quite sure if you're using the right format, you can always go to one of those templates, do a cut and paste. Well, sometimes that may or may not work, but just take a look online, because usually there are manuscript samples that you can take a look at, that show you how the manuscript should look, and then potentially do like a couple of days edit or rewrite where all you're doing is you're just focusing on the format of the book.
And Michael, I think you mentioned a website regarding formatting earlier, right?
Oh yeah, there's a terrific website run by a writer called William Shunn, which is SHUNN, and he has templates on there, like Word templates that you can download, like ready to go. But he also has like a page with advice on how to actually use the paragraph settings on Word, which is, and actually most of the word processing packages you use, are similar, and have a similar settings. And as Jim was saying earlier, the basics: left aligned, double spaced, no extra spaces between paragraphs, but indent each paragraph. Usually it's half an inch. Little things like, if you're as old as I am, you might have learned to use 2 spaces after a period rather than 1, because you were using typewriters or And the number of people I come across who go, what do you mean it's only one space? And I say, no, it's definitely one space now after a period. And they go, no, it's definitely two. I learned that in school. And it's like, well, so did I, but you know. And there are lots of websites out there. The Williamson one is particularly good. I mean, you also, as a British editor, you know, there are other small differences, like we use single quotation marks, not double, generally speaking, in the UK, which is quite strange to a lot of people because everyone thinks everyone uses double. And it doesn't really matter, to be honest, because the publisher at the end of the day, you know, when you get to the point of hopefully having your book published, we'll sort those kind of things out. But there are little things there. But the Williamson site's really good. I think it's got a very accessible, easy to use template there. But as Jim said, most word processing packages have these things. It's actually quite simple to do, but if you've never used the paragraph functions on your word processing package before, it can seem a little bit daunting at first, but it's actually really, really simple. And that website has pictures of each box and stuff and what to do. And you know, it's like a 5-minute job. You can actually take a manuscript that's been you know, extra spaces between paragraphs, no indents. You can take if you know how to work those things, you can take a manuscript and you can reformat it in a basic fashion in about 5 minutes, as long as the writer hasn't done anything particularly strange to it. And learning that crucial skill is you know, I think something every writer probably would enjoy knowing. So I encourage you to Google it. If
be careful with you know, I mean, the 5-minute fix is great, but also after you've done the 5-minute fix, make sure that you take the time to go through from page 1 to the end to make sure that the formatting took properly. Because
sure, because the
some of that stuff, you know, it'll change, you know, how certain things, you know, were set up. And also, just real quickly, another quick thing is font. New Times Roman. You know, Times Roman. You know, that is your friend. I realize that there are a lot of nifty fonts out there, but again, you're trying not to draw attention to certain things like that, and you know, trying to be clever with your font use is not one of the ways to do it unless you're doing it for a particular effect.
That's terrific.
Perfect. I've got a question more again for Aaron. And it's actually a question I get a lot. It's Lynette Adair. So her novel was first published by a regional press and has sold over 2,000 copies, but seems to have limited reach. So she asks, can you share what types of sales numbers are intriguing to agents and publishers nowadays?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part? I missed it.
Yeah, can you share what types of sales numbers are intriguing to agents?
You know, it's hard to say because agents are very wary of anything that has been already published and taking that on. If it's been self-published or published through an independent publisher. Independent publishers are a little bit harder because the contract might own the rights to your book for a certain period of time. So you need to make sure that you get all those rights back before you query an agent. If you're self-publishing, you own all of your rights, so it's a little bit different. And you probably don't want to share the information of your sales numbers with the agent, just because, unless they're really high. And I would say high is maybe over 20K, probably more around 50K. But anything under that, you want to be really careful about sharing those numbers with them. They won't ask you unless they're already interested in it and they want to sign you. So don't offer up that information on your own.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think a lot of times authors tend to overestimate the quality, let's say the importance of their sales numbers. If you in my experience, if you have sales numbers that are interesting to agents might start to find you directly.
Yeah, and another thing too is that if you do have high sale numbers, they might be worried that you've maxed out your audience, that you've reached pretty much everybody that the book was going to reach already, and therefore there are no extra people to sell it to. So that's why it's pretty tricky when you've already self-published your book. Be pretty limiting on the information that you give them.
Excellent. So now now a question more on short stories and anthologies. So from Zoe Xanos, how does the story arc work within an anthology? Should stories with more tension be placed in the center to mimic the climax, or should each story have a similar tone with small climaxes?
I think that the most important thing about a short story collection is that, I mean, what agents and publishers are definitely looking for is that there's a common theme, and that stories are sort of touching upon the same thing. The story order is not really something that a writer should worry about. If you're going the traditional publishing route, that's, your publisher will figure that out. The most important thing is that your stories all sort of share a similar theme, that they're not all over the place, that you're not writing, science fiction stories with more literary fiction stories, that it all sort of, relates to the same thing.
Perfect. So we had a little typo on that reedsy.com/a/the right practice link. I corrected it on the fly, but for those of you who tried that link before, try again now with this punctuation. Talking about mechanics and using spell checks. Probably for you again, Aaron. So regarding the beginning and ending. So Sagar Rai's question is, do agents skim through the book? Like, do they read from beginning to end, or do they jump to and fro? Let's see. Yeah.
Well, I think it depends upon the agent and how interested they are in your sample. If they're very hooked from the beginning, they might sit down and actually read everything very carefully. If they're slightly intrigued and they want to see if you are a good writer, and they want to see, if I skim this, how interested will I be? They might just skim it. I mean, agents are extremely busy, so I would say 95% of the time they're skimming everything that they read. And it's that 5% where they're sitting down and really into it and reading. That's where you want to be. And that's why I said earlier, it's so important to get those first 10 pages to the point of brilliance, because if you can hook them there, then once they get your full manuscript, they're going to be hooked as well and reading really closely and carefully.
Perfect. So I have a question, Gladys Bauer. What's the best way to get beta readers, excluding friends and relatives? So I can answer that quickly. I'd say first, get your friends and relatives in your beta reading team, especially those who read, who are readers of your genre. And then if you want to go outside that circle, have a look at communities. So they can be physical communities, if they're like readers groups around where you live, and there can be online communities, lots of Facebook groups. If you go to Facebook and type in your genre and then reader, you're going to be amazed at the number of groups, of Facebook groups there are of readers of your genre. Not all of them are going to be active, but if you join them, if you take a look at them all, I'm pretty sure you're going to find one or two that are going to be very active and readers talking about books and interacting with writers, and that's probably where you can find beta readers. If you're not on Facebook, there are still some Google Plus communities active as well. Goodreads is a good place. Lots of Goodreads groups where you can find basically online friends. And last advice is other authors in your genre. All authors are readers. So if there are authors in your genre that are not too famous, obviously you're not going to ask J.K. Rowling to be your beta reader. But if there are other authors you really like in your genre that are not, you think are not too busy, drop them a line, let them know that you like their books, offer to join their beta reading team, especially if they're indie authors, they're going to be definitely receptive to that. And then wait for the offer of reciprocity. Interesting. So we've got a question on editing, but it's more on how to become an editor. So Morgan Newell says, while I would love to write novels, I also really enjoy editing. What are some steps I can take to become an editor or a literary agent? Any specific classes in college, for example?
Well, I had the same dream, and I was maybe 26, I think, no, 25, somewhere around there. And I just decided to kind of change my career path, and I went to get my MFA in creative writing, which basically landed me here. So that's one option. I don't want to say you have to go out and spend, you know, $30,000 or $50,000 on education, but that's one way to do it. And other ways would be to go out to publishing houses or to literary agencies and see if they need interns, and that's a great way to start, and it's free.
No, that is very good. You know, Hachette, who I used to work for, you know, they would do an internship program every year, and the interns would often be randomly placed in various departments. It might be editorial, might be managing edit, might be man ed, might be production manufacturing. The real advantage to that is that you get a taste of not just, you know, the quote unquote sexy part of being in book publishing, which is being an editor, you know, for a particular author, but you get to learn about, you know, managing editorial, which is what we do. Or you can learn about production manufacturing, which is something that I also do, where you're physically, you know, handling the actual construction of the book itself. You could end up in marketing, you could end up in publicity. But the really great part about doing an internship is even if you don't end up in the department that you think really speaks to you, by being an intern, you're already on that company's radar. And then when you're out looking for a job, you know, then you have an easier time of getting in the door. The main thing to keep in mind is that, you know, as I said, you know, the editors for authors are perceived as the sexy, you know, the sexy bit for publishing. You know, that's what everybody wants to be. But also realize that when any editorial assistant job pops up at a particular publishing company, they are flooded with resumes, absolutely flooded. So, you know, being an intern, you know, that will give you a leg up, but also having been an intern that they liked will make it even better. But also, you know, or you've interned, you know, like not once, but maybe twice with that particular company, you know, but also be interested in some of the other, you know, options that come available, you know, like, you know, there are, you know, editorial assistant jobs in man ed. I mean, yeah, you're going to be making a lot of photocopies and sending out a lot of stuff over UPS, but you'll also be learning the mechanics of how proofreading, copy editing, and the other nuts and bolts side of editing works.
I think just to add that, I think the internship thing is great, and Penguin Random House UK run a certain number of those, and there are also diversity programs as well that various UK publishers run. I think it's probably fair to say, if you're looking at a career in editing as well, though, that this probably might sound a silly thing to say, but it's one of those strange careers that it's very, very, very sought after, but also doesn't really pay very well. So it's people don't get into editing to get rich for the most part.
Wait, we don't?
I think that's something to be aware of. I mean, we do okay, but it is an enriched business, and you will have fierce competition to get a job, and it is a question of, like Jim said, if you can even get a job as a PA or something, working for an editor, that's a good shoe-in. My career path, I worked in bookselling for 15 years, and I jumped from being a head office fiction buyer to being an editorial director. I cheated in a way. I went from one. I spent a huge amount of time working one bit of the business, then worked in the other. I know a lot of people who've gone from bookselling to publishing in some form, whether it's sales or editing or whatever. I'm not saying it's an easy path, but it is a path worth looking at. And I think what we said about education before, there is certainly over here in the UK, there is the rise of the publishing master's degree. And I think there are a lot of people applying for jobs now who are going that, they're doing a BA in a suitable, or BSc in a suitable subject, whether it's English lit or history or whatever it happens to be. And then they're going and doing a master's in publishing, and they do learn an awful lot of, like an accelerated career path. But then they often still end up going and doing an internship or working in maybe not the bit that they exactly want to go into. So
yeah, that was my path. I started in production manufacturing, then ended up in managing editorial. It's all very different paths, but it's it's just a matter of finding a path and sticking with it, and not giving up.
Perfect. Erin, maybe to close the webinar, do you want to tell us about your path? How does one become a literary agent?
Yeah, so as I said, I got my MFA, and I was actually fortunate enough to not have to intern. I live in LA, and if you're in the US and you don't live in New York, it's very, very difficult to get a publishing job. It's nearly impossible. So I really lucked out in that I found a great agent who was looking for an assistant. And I started working through him, and he taught me the ropes, and then I became an agent. Another good piece of advice for people who don't live in New York or London or other places throughout the world that have publishing houses is to look for literary magazines and to try and get your editorial experience through there, because a lot of literary magazines work through the internet and through remote editing and getting together remotely. And I did that while I was in school, which kind of helped me get some experience. That might be an option.
It might be worth mentioning one other thing. While obviously working as a commissioning editor, acquiring and publishing books and editing them, there is also the copy editor and proofreader path. And there are, certainly in the UK, there's things like the Society of Editors and Proofreaders, which they have a lot of, and the Publishers Training Centre, you have a lot of essentially accredited courses you can do, and you can become a qualified copy editor without having worked for a publisher perhaps, and then you can get freelance work. So I mean, that is another way of working with books. It's perhaps I'm not saying it's easier way, that's not right, and a good copy editor is a rare and precious thing, I can't stress that enough, and proofreaders. But it is an interesting side of the business, and it's a very rewarding side of the business, and you can go to it, certainly in the UK anyway, you can do the appropriate courses, and they're not ridiculously expensive compared to going and doing a master's degree. And then you can kind of like work your way up, I mean, that is probably a freelance path for the most part in the UK. Publishing houses in the UK don't tend to hire full-time copy editors or proofreaders. They tend to use freelancers. So actually over here, it's kind of a good business. And with people like Reedsy there, it's also an interesting way of gaining experience. Although you probably need to get the experience before joining Reedsy. But that's an interesting path as well, and can lead into other areas of the business.
NYU has an editing certificate as well, and I'm willing to bet that there are other smaller colleges that have similar programs.
Perfect. Well, on that note, I'd like to say thanks to everyone, Laura, Erin, Jim, Michael, thanks so much for taking part in the webinar today. I hope everyone enjoyed it. You're going to have the slides. You're going to have the replay available on YouTube. I'm going to put a bunch of links to the different books that were mentioned, authors that were mentioned, resources below the video in the YouTube description as well, so you have everything in one place. And again, don't forget the little link if you want to use Reedsy in the future.